Good morning, everybody. I'm Clare Burgess. I lead the Green Finance Initiative at Clifford, and I'm really delighted to be here today with you all. Thank you for having me. I did have some opening remarks. Actually, the intro speakers have covered a lot of them, so maybe I can pick up some slightly different points. Because I was asked to do sort of an introduction to what's going on in sustainable finance more generally, sort of across the market beyond Islamic finance. I can't do that very quickly, and we need to keep to time, so I shall do a shameless plug for our book, which is on growing the green economy. There's a focus on green, but it also does cover some social aspects. This is available online, of course, because we don't want to print too many copies, but please do have a look at that. It's got a lot of information in. And really, the reason why we're publishing this book, and we did last year, is because at the moment there is a huge amount of change and movement in the area of sustainability and ESG. We call it the snowball effect, because we're seeing what started as a development bank product has now moved more increasingly into the mainstream. Because governments have taken on obligations through the Paris Agreement and other initiatives, they have some emphasis behind them in terms of moving the dial on, particularly on climate, but I think that goes across to social impacts as well. And we're seeing, the ordinary person, the taxpayer, the consumer, the customer, really looking to understand more about what's going on, what impact certain activities are having in the world, and what they can do, how they can put their pounds and dollars to work in a different way to change things. So there is a lot of change coming, and we've seen a snowball in regulation, legislation, some initiatives and guidelines. And one of those things we just picked up in the keynote was around, what do we mean by ESG? And are we aligned across industries? And it seems, there's obviously a definition that we have within Islamic finance of what we think is a social good. That may differ from what a development bank may consider to be a social good, or a commercial bank, or an institutional investor. And a lot of the work at the moment, you may be aware of the European Commission work, is around trying to have a common understanding of what we mean by green in particular, sustainable, and that's the work around the European Commission's taxonomy. And the title of the talk today, we're talking about social aspects beyond green. Actually, the social aspect at the moment in what's coming together as a consensus across industry is rather underplayed. The focus really is on climate, because that's what's making the headlines. And people are aware that we need to do more in the area of social. We have minimum social safeguards in defining sustainability, but they won't go as far as most people will look for in terms of a positive social impact. So we did touch on the green bond market, which is a new market. We've got the green loan products, we've got social bonds, but this is, although we talk about the $200 billion number, this is a tiny, tiny element of the capital markets. It's less than 2% of the capital markets. So whilst it's quite novel to have this use of proceeds concept, finally, some people think, where is my money going, rather than general corporate purposes. People have got on board with that, but it's still a very small element. And a lot of the information at the moment, a lot of the regulation is really just around disclosure. We're not going to tell you what to do or what not to do, but please tell the market what you're doing so that people can understand that and take their own decisions. And I think we're saying today, we want actually to be more ambitious than that. We want to go further. So it's with great pleasure I introduce the panel. I'm sure many of them will be known to you. Starting on this side, we have Stella Cox from DDCap. Then we have Sultan Choudhury. Then we have Keith Alderman, who's very kindly stepped in, thank you, at NDI Takaful. Then Ummahani, Amin from the Metropolitan Skills company. And then at the far end, from Deloitte's Hatim El-Tahir. And we really want to have a look at how Islamic finance has performed to date. And then we're going to start off with a little bit of a scorecard. And if I can ask Stella to kick off, how do you think Islamic finance is performing against the rest of the market and against our aspirations?
Okay. Thank you very much, Claire. And before I start, the nice video at the beginning, I would like to assure everybody here today that I do change my clothes more than once a year. It's all a bit unfortunate. It's a bit like your Sunday best jacket, isn't it? But there we are. So in terms of your question, Claire, well, our industry is really just starting out. If we look at our financial industry subset in Islamic finance, we go back 5 years or more to 2014. I think that was really the first signs we had of engagement with core sort of impact, reflecting on impact, looking at responsible practices. And in terms of transactions, that was probably illustrated through the benchmark sukuk issued by the International Finance Facility for Immunisation, $500 million to accelerate funding through Gavi the Vaccine Alliance, and also through the Malaysian government developing an SRI sukuk framework, and subsequently that has supported the impact of, it has supported impact sukuk issued by Khazanah, the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and also more recently by HSBC Ummahani with its sukuk that was issued in support of satisfaction of the SDGs. There's been a smattering of issuance with a more typically traditionally green, environmentally considered alignment, and you were just referencing to sort of general purposes. And I think what the government of Indonesia has done has been great. You know, they have come out, they shocked the market to an extent that it was Indonesia with the sovereign green sukuk. They've come back to the market. And also more recently this year, we've gone to corporate with Majid Al Futtaim with its issuance back in the summer. So capital markets transactions are great, they're illustrative, they catch headlines, you know, and even in terms of Islamic finance, the S word, the sukuk, the press love it. There's scale, there's profile, name of issuers. But our industry, in Islamic finance, we're notable for our weighting to banks and banking transactions. And there, I agree with some of the speakers before on the points that Rafi was making. It's more of a challenge. There's been a lot of discussion in the industry and amongst banks about Maqasid al-Sharia, which Rafi obviously covered very eloquently, and industry's been seeking a wider entry point, not just looking at capital market issuance, into sustainable and responsible practices. But I would say, and I sit on the board of trustees of the RFI Foundation, which is an industry think tank for such engagement, and I've worked with various different forums. Awareness has been lacking to an extent, and you know, Clare was talking already about the discussions that are going on at global level about SRI and ESG and formulating propositions. If we are looking at an industry that sometimes challenges itself about its own levels of standardisation and how it determines Sharia compliance and how many standards we have for sukuk issuance, when we start to shake that up and talk about E's and S's and G's as well, it becomes quite complicated. So what does it all mean? Let's look at some of the organisations that might be relevant. PRI, there was some discussion about that. DDCap was one of the first Islamic financial signatories to PRI. We're an intermediary. We're a UK firm. We work in the Islamic financial space. And as Rafi said, there's just a handful of OIC country firms who are represented as signatories on PRI. And actually, they're diminishing to an extent. And why is that? PRI has suddenly gone from voluntary to mandatory reporting. And as a mandatory reporter, and my colleague Jennifer, who heads the SRA at DDCap, is here today, and she can tell you more about it. It has been extremely difficult, even for us, as an international financial sector firm to report back. So I think it's extremely challenging. And actually, as an intermediary working in the Islamic financial space with its weighting to banking, that's been complicated as well. I'm enthused by the new PRB. What I would say, cautionary note, not everybody's CIMB and Gatehouse, and I think some of our banks will be challenged actually to go through those processes. They're going to need guidance. Who is going to guide them? Also for Islamic finance, because of the construction of our contracts, the way in which the industry works, there's a lot of intermediation that happens in the banking space. When I look at PRB, there doesn't seem to be an immediately eligible category for intermediary firms in the same way that PRI has. So that's maybe something that the signatories can address. So finally, looking at the engagement and how Islamic banks perhaps find a wider entry point. You know, I have to touch very briefly on the SDGs. And the General Council for Islamic Banks and Financial Institutions, SIBAFI, focused its 2019 Global Islamic Bankers Survey on social and development issues. And forgive me if I read a little bit from SIBAFI, because it is really illuminating. Part of this report was focused on the SDGs. Islamic banks were asked to rank through a series of questions the importance to them of each of the 17 goals. And this is illustrative as well. We're looking at the goals themselves, but as as a firm that is supportive of delivery against the goals. You know, DDCap is challenged again in looking at what those objectives are within each one of the goals. So, you know, when we're just looking at what the goals themselves mean, we've got a bit of curve catch up to do. So they're looking at the goals as part of their strategic business development and in terms of importance in enabling them to deliver against the objectives of Sharia. The focus was restricted, so it just looked at banking, forget capital markets, and I've already discussed that. But as a report, I think it gave one of the most expansive illustrations of how SIBAFI members, an important group of Islamic banks, understand the SDGs and how they're working out their individual and collective roles in developing their understanding and their delivery against the objectives. So 106 banks, 33 countries. The global outcome showed that goals related to economic growth and development are most important. And thereafter, individual goals such as 4, quality education, and 1, no poverty. At the bottom were goals linked to climate, natural environment, and biodiversity. Now, there's a sort of global approach that SIBAFI took, and then it broke the responses down into regions. And those responses, biodiversity and environmental considerations, were at the bottom in virtually every one of the regions, even though the responses were otherwise quite diverse and reflected regional preoccupations. So just in conclusion here, SIBAFI felt that Islamic banks are well attuned to the objectives of Sharia and also to those of the SDGs. But many of them right now are seeing them as just another pillar of compliance. And they're relevant to funds that might be allocated to charitable giving or to corporate social responsibility. And, you know, we're moving on from that. Currently, that missing element is the full integration of the SDGs within the overarching objectives of Sharia within the overall business and activities of the banks. Certain banks are targeting that integration, great, but it brings me back to the wider global perspective that I was just talking about with, you know, global signatories to PRI and maybe to PRB. Challenged enough as it is, you know, if we are really going to put some thought around this and push our overweighted banking sector into delivering against the objectives, we really have to give some critical thought now about how that guidance is going to be provided and how they're going to be supported. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a long catch-up process.
Interesting. And lots of interesting points in that. I think the one that I took away was, you know, in the sense from today, if people are, you know, doing their own thing almost with their own categorisations and not engaging with what become, you know, industry-wide initiatives, are we really missing a trick in that? In the sense that, you know, I talk to a lot of banks and I say, look, you need to be ahead of this. You need to be there to shape the agenda because, you know, the challenges, I love the 4 words, we are SDG compliant. The 4 words, and it takes so much work to understand whether or not you are, never mind to change your strategy so that you become SDG compliant if that's where you're going. Actually, the mapping against the SDGs is very difficult, and so, you know, to be in there and shaping the conversation, I think is a really important point. Keith, can I just come to you in terms of how you see the performance so far? Would you agree with Stella's comments?
Well, I've got on a scorecard, I'd say about 3 from the insurance market, actually, out of 10. The insurance market itself has been very slow in providing products on a Sharia-compliant basis. We as a broker house saw the opportunity and have actually gone out, travelled the world seeking capacity to actually be able to provide Sharia-compliant contracts. We have actually now sort of just literally starting up a sort of European-based insurance company to provide Sharia-compliant policies into the UK and into Europe. But say as the insurance market really doing anything, we've actually had Lloyd's giving lip service to actually sort of providing products. A lot of talk and no real action is my comment on from an insurance perspective anyway.
Mm. And actually, for the insurance industry, you know, the whole social impacts of climate change in particular have massive implications for your full business, and we've seen the retreat from the insurance industry in certain
areas. You've actually seen a lot of capacity actually sort of coming out of the market because of the sort of social disasters which have been out there, both weather as well as actually individual. So yeah, we've got to actually sort of look to try and bring that capital back in and provide those policies to actually people. And we have to remember we're trying to give people a choice. Yeah. And people haven't had that choice over the last few years, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Hatim, can I come to you in terms of the mapping against SDGs and the comparison between Islamic finance principles and SDGs?
Yeah, absolutely, Claire. talking about Islamic finance and being socially responsible or useful, I think we need to see more of commitment from the banking and investment institutions in terms of developing proper strategies as how they wanted to design and develop products that will finance and fund what we call the priority social sectors. And what I mean by this, housing, education, and healthcare services. We oftentimes in our studies and thought leadership events, we talk to experts, we talk to practitioners, and we ask the questions how Islamic banks can be more socially responsible. We do have a lot of feedback from practitioners saying that we don't see real products that developed in these areas, creating jobs and developing housing products, for instance, so budget houses for graduates, for people to have a decent life. And I wanted to bring the issue of the Arab uprising. The last 5 or 6 years, there's a lot of issues in the Middle East, and graduates are struggling finding decent jobs and looking for a decent life. Fundamentally, Islamic banks, as Rafi was saying earlier, that there are two core purposes for them. One is risk sharing, which we don't have an issue with that, but really creating and designing products that add value to the social is really still questionable. So we see a lot of, and of course in the Middle East we have a number of Islamic banks, but we don't see that these banks are committed and developing products that's designed ultimately to develop a social strategy or social goods, if you like, markets. Not much in the education or housing or developing local communities. I think the SDGs is interestingly timely for Islamic finance to align their strategies. Al-Baraka Bank in 2016, if I remember well, they have developed a social responsibility strategy pledging over $600 million over 4 years to create a number of sub-markets, if you like, within their strategy. And they have announced that they will create over 50,000 jobs in where they operate in 16 countries. Also tap the market of health care services and develop projects, finance projects, as well as education. So I think we need to see a social charters within these Islamic financial institutions, more commitment, triple our commitment, if you like, to design products and create markets within the bigger social infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. So some progress being made, but we need more ambition, and we need to drive that change throughout the Islamic finance industry.
Absolutely.
So that's a question to the driver of financial industries, Sultan. If you could think about how would you see progress being made most efficiently here?
Yeah. So thanks, Claire. I think one of the insights that I'd like to kind of remark upon is, and it would be an obstacle, a potential obstacle for developing banks towards social goals, is how ownership structures work. And as a CEO, and it's not talking about my own experience, I'm sure it's the same for the CEOs of all Islamic banks practically, is how do you move from one to the other, where you've got an explicit goal because of the ownership structure. They're usually owned by stock market listed entities, or they've got an explicit profit goal. How do you move to a wider set of socially purposeful goals? And I think that becomes that's kind of almost going to the enterprise level, but ultimately you have to deal with that, given that most of the players are Islamic banks. I think I agree very much with the comments from Rafi and Hatim, and largely I was going to echo some of those, but I'll just pick on items that I think need emphasizing. So you've got this, you've got a profit goal. How do you then direct your activity to socially purposeful goals? Right? So how do you direct, I don't know, for example, in the UK to financing housing association, if you want to alleviate homelessness, or to financing a charity that might be actively involved in a sector of society tackling a social problem. Now that's quite difficult for a number of reasons that Rafi mentioned in terms of the way banks are operating today, right? So first of all, the goal, not exclusively, but mostly focuses on that stakeholder, the shareholder today. And actually, when you look at why Islamic banks were given a license, at least in this country, part of it was to sort of tackle financial exclusion and social, and thereby social exclusion. Somewhere along the line, aspects of that goal kind of just dissipated a bit. Yes, so fundamentally, we have contract structures that embody more social justice because of some elements of risk and reward. Great. That's necessary, it's not sufficient. You've got negative screening, i.e. we avoid sectors, but we don't proactively target a sector for social reasons. We just say, yeah, okay, that'll make things worse, but we don't say, right, let's go after, I don't know, housing associations or charities or whatever, right? So that's problematic. So then you say, well, okay, can I build in goals for the other stakeholders that Omar mentioned in his speech, consumers and employees and the community at large. And just touching on that from an Islamic perspective, we talked about maqasid al-Sharia, and for the next panel, it'll be really interesting to hear, where does maslaha and public interest, what we call public interest, where does that sit in terms of the goals of an organization that purports itself to be Islamic? So that's a maslaha I think it's something that we can talk maybe at another panel. I'll ask the question if it's not raised by the panelists. But so you've got to do that. So just to touch a couple of things, there's a cost. Shareholders have to accept that at one level, you may not get the profits of a profit-maximizing organization. At a consumer level, you may not pay the cheapest price as an employee, because you're working in a purposeful organization that's trying to do more than just generate profit. You might accept that I'll take a lower salary because I feel a deeper satisfaction in what I do. Now, of course, there's this premium curve that exists, consumer psychology. How far will you go? How far will you pay? How much of a salary cut will you take? How much profit will you, relinquish? And I think these are questions at the operating level that have to be tackled. And maybe for later, I'll just mention it now, so I'm conscious it's the introductory. One of the ways of tackling it, other than going to existing organizations and trying to get them to change their goals or think of wider goals, I think that's worthy efforts. And I'd like to congratulate IFC on getting the SDG task force funding, so I think you'll do a great job on that. One of the ways is for social capital to start owning financial institutions. If social capital, so people who currently give to charities or currently give to charitable endowments, they start owning or initiating financial institutions, then there is no conflict. The social goal is there through the owners. You target consumers who believe in those goals. You fund projects where social entrepreneurship isn't required, and it becomes very much, a virtuous circle, right? And I think that's, if you just look at the way banking works, where your pound of capital can give you 6 times the amount of finance just through risk weighting ratios, well then that pound that you currently donate to a charity could be giving you 6 times the impact through a banking channel, a bank that's owned by, a social institution. So I think that's something to just throw out in the mix. I'm conscious that I didn't have a company on the back. I am working on 3 startups, and one of them is a social endowment, which will hopefully start tackling that.
Excellent. I mean, I think you raise a really important question there around sort of profit versus purpose. And again, sort of looking at the wider market, there's a lot going on around that in terms of, the UN has done a lot of work on fiduciary duty to sort of show that actually it is a fiduciary duty to consider the impact on particularly environment. I think environment is so much easier than social because with environment you have what I think most people would say is an under-recognised cost to balance sheets from not doing anything about climate change. So actually investing in something that mitigates or prevents climate change will impact in a positive way financially. But interestingly, for the same point, when I talk to several UN PRI investors and say, how much yield are you prepared to sacrifice in order to invest in a green bond or a social bond? I think you probably know the answer, which is zero. There is a small pricing differential when you see things, I'm sure you can talk better than me, that see things trading, but as yet people are not really putting that money where the mouth is.
Yes.
So you wanted to come in on that?
Yes, Claire, just want to get back to Sultan's about the point of profit versus social return here. I still believe that banking institutions can still design products where there is, the opportunity of creating markets that's profitable. The social services sectors, like the education and housing, creating housing, affordable housing, for instance, creating jobs in different sectors, it still can be profitable. What are the issues here? I don't see any issue or challenge for you as a banker to balance between
profitable, yes, but maximizing profit versus an acceptable return. And look, without going into too much detail, I've faced that dilemma, right?
Sure.
So you can maybe go for double-digit returns, but you're going to have to sacrifice some of your other goals, or you can go for a good return and still do both, right?
I mean, I agree as well. If you move out of other sectors, if you look at corporates, and I think I was talking earlier, I think it was Omer who mentioned BlackRock, and big corporations are buying into this. Sometimes the leadership's a little bit challenged in working it out. They haven't got all the data they require really to absolutely prove that there's an impact on their stock price and so on. But they are working out that actually, even though there's not an immediate impact on the balance sheet, engaging with social situations and creating impact has a positive effect on them and their stakeholders. And I think as Sultan has just illustrated very well, the problem in banking is that the stakeholder weighting is different. Yeah. And particularly in Islamic finance, we have sizable Islamic banks that are quite traditional with their output and their product. And there I agree with Claire. If you look at our traditional Islamic banks, I think they have the suite of instruments available to them that will make them quite effective, regulatory permissions prevailing to move into issuance of sukuk for environmental considerations and so on, and we've got all sorts of situations and transactions that I described that I think demonstrate that. But when we look at impact, we've got to change the model a little bit, and that's where we have a problem, because a lot of the banks that we have at the moment will find it hard to engage. Now we've got the absolutely brilliant Ramya Gopalan with us later, so I'm not going to steal any of her thunder, but moving on to blended finance opportunities, and that's something that the leaders of this industry are trying to articulate deeper into industry stakeholders at the moment, how we can change the models. Because you look at the Gavi Sukuk for immunisation, benchmark Sukuk, great, but is that really how we are going to create impact going forward? Ramya and the IFRC with the IDB are looking at a blended finance model that's going to help to eradicate cholera in certain countries. But it's a real challenge for them, and it's going to be a couple of years in the working, because it's going to bring in a risk-sharing model to industry that really we haven't embraced fully, and that's going to cause us to open the dialogue to a whole different subset of investors, to go beyond banks and to go beyond our traditional banking environment, and to really reshape, I think, the nature of what we're trying to achieve within our industry sector.
risk sharing is also, it can be quite difficult when you're looking at individual investments, right? It's a lot more complicated in a retail, if you like, market. And the insurance industry and the cat bonds and similar come to that. I mean, you can share risk, but...
it's actually because in the insurance market is very much looking at you picking your partners who you want to share that risk with.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the difficult thing, and how you then bring that back to distribute any profit which may be residing within that operation or that mutual. But I say mutuals have been around for years and years and years. It's just now actually moving it into using the funds within those mutuals to actually invest into more social businesses.
Ummahani, can I come to you in terms of your experiences in Africa and Nigeria in particular, and where have you seen some success stories? Let us finish up with some success stories as to where the Islamic finance is having a real impact.
Okay, so I've listened to everyone, and I'm going to tell you about the Nigerian experience, about social impacts. We did the sukuk. Before the sukuk came on, the federal government sukuk, there was a sukuk in Osun State, a state of Nigeria, which dealt with infrastructure as well, building schools, which was quite successful. But for the federal government, it was like 3 years ago, it started with, and it was still infrastructure sukuk, which has really impacted on the Nigerian society. Because people now were beginning to realize that Islamic finance is right on our faces. The impact is huge, is very important, and everyone was going around because the sukuk, we did the federal government sukuk, it was 100 billion naira sukuk, which was oversubscribed, the first one. And then the second one, the same thing, was oversubscribed. So Nigerians were beginning to be like, okay, so let's look at Islamic finance and how it can impact on the society. If you go on the roads, you will see specifically written federal government sukuk rules. So even, you know how Nigeria is very sensitive when it comes to Islamic finance because there's a division. If you like, suspicious beliefs, Muslims and Christians thinking that Islamic finance is just for Muslims, and so we're trying to Islamize Nigeria and all that. And the Muslims thinking, oh my God, there is Islamic finance for us as Muslims. So now we've gone to a stage where, we're higher than the Muslims, the Christians. Remember, in Nigeria, we're 50-50 Muslim Christians, and it was a huge battle from the beginning to say, okay, this is Islamic finance. Sanusi Lamido, now the Emir of Kano, when he was at Central Bank, started Islamic finance, and he wanted an Islamic bank. He propelled for that. And it wasn't a huge success from the beginning because people were very backwards. No, I don't want to touch that. It's Muslim. And the Muslims are. So Professor Munzal Kaf always says something. Islamic finance is not Islam. Whenever he says that, there's a lot of controversy. Oh no, how can you say that? But he is right. And that is what Nigerians are beginning to get into right now. Trying to say that, okay, this is very productive. It has brought a lot of goodwill to people, to people's lives. Now people can travel from one part of the road to the other because there's a federal government sukuk. They realized that the risks were minimal, almost none when it comes to investments. People are getting returns for their investments. So Nigeria is propelling towards that level where Islamic finance will come to stay. With banks springing up now, we just had one bank, Jaiz Bank. Now, the other bank is coming up now. Doctor, you are a part of our Sharia board in Nigeria, so you know a lot more about this. There's another bank. There are insurance companies, Takaful companies coming up. Just last month, 2 Takaful companies were approved by the regulatory authority. So we're looking at good things in Islamic finance in Nigeria. And hopefully everyone is beginning to understand that there's a correlation between financial inclusion and economic development. So people are beginning to say, okay, yeah, we're ready for Islamic finance in Nigeria. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And consumer-led, it seems, and I think all in the sort of theme of the just transition, which is a theme around climate change being socially inclusive and ensuring that everyone is brought along, both whether it's a financial return or a sort of community return by investments. I think you're seeing that on the ground, on the roads specifically. Yeah. Have we got any questions from the audience? Yeah. We got microphones?
Very couple of points. Please forgive me if these are not questions. So my name is Hassan Shani. I've always worked for secular organisations, so I used to work for Nestle's pension funds until June, and I'm independent now. With the first speech and the talk now, the two themes that have come up again and again, and actually, to tell you the truth, I attended a Islamic Finance conference about 10 years ago, and one or two sentences repeated at this conference just in these first couple of hours. So first thing is that if we just look at ESG, now, I don't speak for Nestle, I don't work for them, but I did used to work for them. Now, amongst the big multinationals and the conscious multinationals, they now say that ESG is no longer a nice to have. Basically, the choice is not between medium returns and high returns, the choice is between returns and no returns. With the millennials coming on board with their different perspective, I mean, a company like Nestle, despite being a listed company, they do look 50 years into the future. Yeah, and people like Pepsi as well, they concluded that if we don't reduce sugar, if we don't move into other areas, we're simply not going to exist as a company anymore. So forget about the high returns and everything. We won't be there. So this is why these very big, gigantic organizations, which are very difficult to maneuver, they've invested so much in moving to ESG, not because it's a nice to have, but because it's a must. It will affect the bottom line. It's already affecting the bottom line. So the second point that is coming again and again, and I love the analogy by the first speaker when I think he said that it's a rugby team trying to play football in the football field, or it was the other way around. Mm-hmm. So what actually happened is the rugby team started at the Central Mosque in Regent's Park, and they looked for a field, and they saw this dazzling stadium called Emirates, and they said, oh, it even has an Islamic name. So they started playing rugby there, in a football stadium. What actually happened is you have to do what the wasl bisabr, not only look for the truth, but have a bit of patience. If they had travelled a bit further around on the South Africa Road and found Twickenham, they might have been able to, start
quite a lot
better.
Further around.
So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, and this is is that this word came up again and again. I feel, and it's not a criticism, maybe it was, that the Islamic finance world has been obsessed with banks. Banks are very elitist as a model of, financial intermediation. They've been obsessed with it. But in fact, in the secular world, where I come from, there are large Islamic, sort of institutions which are not banks, basically equity pools, like pension funds in the UK or in Europe, mutual funds in the United States. The Islamic world perhaps should have, now it's a good time now that we're reimagining things, look to try and establish equity pools and look to try and develop equity pools. Now, there's two things about equity pools. One is the short term and the long term. If we, often what the other Islamic practitioners make a mistake is that they go to the to equity pools, they look at what entrepreneurs require, but entrepreneurs always require high rate of return. Now, the central bank in this country, they invented a word which is now becoming common parlance, and everybody's grabbing up. They invented a phrase called patient capital. In fact, Islamic finance always was about patient capital. So sorry about this long-winded non-question.
That's very
There's just 2 points. Was that ESG is no longer a nice to have, and secondly, that Islamic finance has to move towards equity and move away from this issue with banks, because banks are always going to think that way.
Or equity in banks. So no, I think that it's very good. Any comments on those?
I think broadly we were in agreement in terms of banks. So I think my references to banks were that has been the way that the sector has been weighted, and talking about some of the ideas and the concepts you'll hear later is that we are trying to move away from it. But it is a challenge, and we still have to work with the banks that we have and the environment to see how we can get them better engaged. But completely agree that banking capacity is not going to be enough to move and deliver against the SDG objectives or whatever without something more, and without the right social infrastructure for delivery as well. And in terms of ESG, I mean, if you look at the UK, I was reading an article that yesterday or the day before that said 2018 was the year that ethical living went mainstream in the UK, and you were talking about millennials, and I was thinking about, you know, certain fashion magazines dedicating whole issues to sustainable and responsible practice, recycling, you know, environmental and labour and animal welfare concerns, and they're driven by predominantly another very important consumer group, which are women. So there are all sorts of different dynamics coming into this, and as consumers, of course, that's impacting how corporations are thinking as well. So I agree with you broadly about what you're saying about the equity pools. I just caveat that slightly with saying, absolutely agree, but we've got to work out how to do it.
If I may, just one of the key phrases has been consumer-led. Right? So why have Nestlé done that? You know, it's consumers and millennials and the change in society that's driving it. So, you know, some of these obstacles that we've talked about how to convince people to pay more, for investors to change their expectations. You have to, and I'm sure this will be covered later, we have to be able to measure that extra benefit over and above the financial return. And there are obviously challenges in that. And I think, you know, some work has to be done to make that easier. So then actually a consumer doesn't think I'm just getting 5%, I'm actually getting 5% and I'm doing social good, or an investor's going, well, look, this is the impact I'm making beyond it. And it's just not mature enough right now to make the case to some of those stakeholders. And I think that's an important area that has to be developed.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Maybe one more? Yep, from the back. Sorry. Over lunch? No.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Namira, and I'm very enthusiastic on how to use Islamic finance for poverty and inequality. So I'm very interested on the explanation from Nigeria. So my question is specifically addressed for Nigeria about sukuk infrastructure. So my question is, first, how did it all begin? Like, what were the approaches taken by the government to introduce sukuk to the country? And in which area are the sukuk infrastructure investment are mainly concentrated? Like, are there any consideration for inequality issues when deciding the area of intervention? And also, is there any nationally designed measurement to measure the impact of the sukuk infrastructure for the country's development objectives? And second is, has there been any consideration by the Nigerian government to utilize Islamic finance beyond infrastructure, perhaps for poverty alleviation? Thank you.
Thank you. First, you asked about how it all started. Okay, so for the sukuk to have started, it started from the DMO, that's the Debt Management Office. It was initiated by that, and that's because there was popular demand that everyone around the world, Nigeria like to conform, you know, with what is going on around the world. And what is going on is Islamic finance. So government is looking at that. Government has been looking at that for the past decade. And eventually they agreed to start the sukuk in relation with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Central Bank of Nigeria, and then the Debt Management Office initiated it. Initially, it was a bit not accepted, but since it's a social infrastructure, that's we build roads, and the roads were being divided according to, we have zones in Nigeria. We have the northwest, the northeast, southeast, and you know, and so the roads were divided equally. There was equality in the division of how the infrastructure should be done in Nigeria from the north, south, east. So everyone came together to say, oh, this has really impacted on our lives. It's easy for us to travel from one place to the other, and it it was like a union of minds between the Muslims and the Christians. Now everybody has seen the social impact of the sukuk. That was the first one, and then they wanted another one. And the second one just finished, and investors from all over Nigeria, Muslims, Christians, were also getting their returns on investments as it was agreed from the beginning. So for Nigeria, it's a very good thing that has started. And now I'd like to talk about, okay, the financial inclusion aspect. I am from the northern part of Nigeria, northeast, where there's a lot of havoc going on there now. And Islamic Finance is looking at socially responsible investments, like we're creating works now. Even the wealthy people are looking at, okay, how can I improve the lives of the people around me? How can I go to the IDPs and say, okay, I want to help out with this, I want to help out with that. So structures are coming up. Trustees are looking at Islamic Finance now as a means of trying to put to the Muslim clients and even the non-Muslim clients to see how they can do socially responsible investments. I have been working with FBN Quest trustees for the past 3 years. They've been doing Islamic estate planning clinic. They've gotten Muslim clients to come on board to say, okay, this is what we want to do. We want to start up a waqf. We want to start an investment that will be socially impactful on the people. So Nigeria is looking at it. We are supposed to do a conference in Nigeria for November 4th and 5th, and for the first time, it's the 4th conference. We do biannually, 4th African International Conference, and for the first time, everyone is trying to get involved. Before now, we try to say, okay, this is the conference, we work, we bring people. Omar from IFC has been very helpful, with regulations in Nigeria, with NICOM, with the conference. But this time around, it's going to be in November. Everybody is showing interest. Everyone, non-Muslims, people keep calling, okay, how can we be involved in the conference? We want to be a part of the conference. So Islamic Finance for Nigeria is right on our faces, and we're ready now. I don't know if I've answered all your...
Perfect answer and a lovely place to stop. Very positive note to end on.
Yes.
So consumer-led change is coming.
If I can just add a little bit, because I was involved in the sukuk.
Okay.
In terms of monitoring, and you were asking about the monitoring, one of the conditions that we put when we approve the sukuk is that the Sharia committee as well as the CBN, the central bank, should be involved with the DMO in monitoring the sukuk. Therefore, actually in every Sharia committee meeting that we have, we got the report from the DMO on the progress as well as how the funds are utilized. You see, so
Correct.
There is a constant, for the first sukuk as well as the second sukuk.
Yeah, I was also on the legal part, solicitor to the trustees. So everything was done, part by part, and everyone was in tune with what's going on. And
thank you. And that picks up the point about having the impact to be demonstrable, so that people can have faith and trust in that they're putting their money to a genuinely social impact rather than and accepting the maybe different return on that basis. That's a very good point to end before I get evicted. So please can you join me in thanking the panel who've been excellent in the usual way. Thank you.